In the parlance of social justice, there are many forms of privilege, and these are typically identified in opposition to a form of oppression. We say that minorities in predominantly white countries are oppressed, and therefore white people have white privilege. Or we say that females are oppressed under patriarchy, and therefore men who do not have to face such oppression have male privilege. Or we say that people who are not poor have a form of class privilege, whether they're middle class or upper class. And I think that when we call a person privileged, in general, the most basic, most vanilla connotation of it is that that person is born wealthy. And in leftist economics and in leftist social policy and just leftist morals in general, we see this as a justification for taking that money through the government, right? If you have extra money, we're going to tax you. We tax the rich much higher than we tax anyone else. And this is seen as a form of justice. We take from the rich and give to the poor. And most people have absolutely no problem with this because they see privilege, particularly in terms of wealth, as something that is unearned. And therefore, because a person just happens to have this by whatever luck, well, why not take it from them? They don't have it for any particular reason that is related to any kind of virtue or risk or hard work that they've done, and therefore we can take it. What's very fascinating is that we can apply this to female privilege, right? Let's look at the economics of sperm versus eggs. Sperm are nearly infinite in supply, whereas eggs are limited. And women have known this and have been able to leverage this in order to secure a privileged position in society, where they do not have to go to war, they don't have to do any actual hard labor. And basically, once they're married off to a man, they can do much easier work at home that's much less taxing, much less strenuous, which is then, reflected in their higher life expectancies across all time and cultures. And, in exchange for this, because they're able to leverage this privileged position, men have been evolving and have been conditioned to be subordinate to women, to be their slaves, to be their house Negroes. And what's very fascinating is that this form of privilege is so pure that there's not even a self-consciousness regarding it, right? If we call someone privileged based on the amount of wealth they have, they understand that this is a bad thing. They understand that this is insulting. And very often they want to hide their wealth because they know that flaunting it is going to make them a target. If not explicitly, because they'll actually be mugged, they'll actually be targeted, they'll actually be someone who you're allowed to publicly resent because of their wealth. But perhaps implicitly as well, in a soft way. People will think, oh, well, this person only has achieved this or that because they're rich. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done anything. And I, a poor person, had to work so much harder to get the same thing, etc., etc. So there's a self-consciousness that comes with class privilege. And to a lesser extent, I would argue, so-called male privilege, as well as white privilege, is that people don't advertise that privilege because they don't want to be seen as a privileged person, because they understand that there's an implication that what they have or what they've done is something unearned, that they should not have or should not be entitled to. However, when it comes to female privilege based on sexual dimorphism, based on just the fact that they're treated better for how they look, they're held to a lower standard, they're given access to more resources just based on the availability of eggs and the possibility of producing children, there's absolutely no self-consciousness regarding this gift that they've received through no work of their own by definition, right? And that's what's so fascinating about this, is that when it comes to privilege based on wealth, there's a fairly good chance that the person has unearned wealth. There's also a fairly good chance that they have wealth based on investments they've made, risks they've taken, hard work that they've done, deferment of gratification, right? And it's some combination of all those things. But the point is that it's not pure. It's not a pure inheritance. It's not a pure dumb luck level of privilege. Whereas with being female, It is. It is by definition, particularly on the biological level. It is a privilege that a person is born with to have these eggs, which they can then leverage to have a husband, to then have a person who will essentially be their slave, their house Negro, who will do backbreaking labor until they die, typically much earlier than the woman does, in order to care for, protect, and provide for the woman. And this is reflected in yet another fascinating way with what's been identified as the femoid Godwin's law, right? The femoid Godwin's law is that if you're arguing with a woman, the likelihood that she will bring up sex or make it all about sex approaches 1. And the fact that this occurs so often and so predictably is literally the equivalent of a rich person saying to someone, you're wrong because you're poor. You're stupid because you're poor. You're inferior because you're poor. I spit on you, poor person. And that's the attitude that a woman is exhibiting when she shames incels, when she shames men for being ugly or creepy, when she speaks down to men as though they're patriarchal oppressors. She's leveraging an unearned privilege, which are her eggs, in order to spit on and shame those who she sees as inferior to her. And it occurred to me so recently that this is really the proper framework to look at this. And what's ironic is that anybody who believes in this leftist sort of sense of justice, where we believe that it's justified for us to use the government to procure resources from the wealthy because, it's privilege, it's unearned, right? We can take opportunities from white people because they have white privilege and give it to non-whites. We can take opportunities from males because they have male privilege, which is unearned, and give it to females. We can take money from the wealthy because, they are privileged and it's unearned wealth, and therefore we need to give it to the poor people because the poor people are poor for no fault of their own other than luck, because it's all just a fucking deterministic, top-down, social constructivist, Marxist pile of just trading luck. And therefore, we have to use the government to create this equality of outcome sort of fake egalitarian bullshit nightmare scenario. If we accept any of those arguments, the number one and first place where we ought to apply it would be regarding female privilege. In other words, if you believe in welfare, if you believe in government redistribution of wealth, there is actually a much stronger, more pure argument to be made that the government should socialize girlfriends. The government should actually ration up all of the females and all of their eggs, and maybe if a woman has an abundance of eggs and is especially fertile, maybe she should be required to produce children for multiple men, because that's only fair, right? They're born with these eggs. These eggs are unearned. It's an unearned form of privilege, and therefore, if you believe that, just as a person born into wealth can be ganked by the government in order to pay for single mothers or drug addicts or whatever, or police, or your stupid roads. If you believe in that, then surely, in order to be consistent, you must also believe in the socialization of girlfriends. And when we consider, the very cruel, very brutal nature of inceldom, which is not a movement, it's not anything organized, it's merely a phenomenon. And it's a phenomenon that we're going to see, a much larger proportion of men dragged into, obviously not of their own volition by definition. And we're going to start to see that this is actually a legitimate social problem in the same way that crime and poverty are. This lack of care and concern for males, this lack of any kind of female interest towards males. And I believe that this rises to the level of justification comparable. Now, to be clear, I don't believe in government because I'm not a terrorist or a savage or a moron. But, most people are at least some combination of some of those things, and they think we have to have government, or they believe everyone else is a terrorist or a savage or a moron. such that humans can never, reach a level where we're not robbing and raping each other. If we're going to accept government, then absolutely the government should be helping us assign girlfriends to every man who is interested. Or at the very least, we need to have some kind of social system of arranged marriages. Because honestly, why should women be entitled to their eggs? They were born with this privilege. They're allowed to leverage those eggs to get near infinite resources. So on what grounds do we say that that's a horrible thing to do? Some people might argue, oh, but that's a woman's body. That's, that you can't just take a person's body. But, if you consider, like very dangerous work where you're risking your body every single day, you consider men sent off to war, having limbs blown off, men smashed by trees when they're doing lumber work, men in factories who get literally eaten by machines. Yeah, it's very much the same. We require men to work in order to be allowed to live. So men are already living in that world. So why shouldn't women? Why shouldn't women? They're born with this extra privilege. They're allowed to trade their eggs for resources, essentially through the marriage contract. And therefore, this is something you can monetize. This is unearned privilege. At the very least, if not forced into marriage, perhaps just as men have civil service, there could perhaps be a draft for surrogacy. We could have a surrogacy draft for women, right? Which could be nice and impersonal. Women can maintain their independence, except, you got to pop out at least a couple kids. Because you were born with the privilege of these eggs, will compensate you for them just as you are compensated for them. But yeah, if we're going to have government programs that are directed at solving widespread social issues, clearly this issue of inceldom, it's not really anyone's fault. Some people are born lucky, some people are born unlucky. And some people who are, born so unlucky that they can never get lucky, perhaps it's something to consider. Especially, again, when we take into account the fact that you didn't do anything to be born a woman. You did absolutely nothing. So on what grounds are you entitled to your eggs, especially if you don't believe in property rights? You don't believe in the right of people to own their own bodies. You don't believe in the right of people to own any kind of property. The government can just take anything. The government can define all the rules for property. That's your basis for believing in property rights. So we'll just have the government redefine property such that you are required to donate some of your eggs to the service of society. Anyway, those are just some thoughts I had. Hope you guys found this interesting, and have a nice day.